we have many questions coming in, and I'm going to get straight to them because I don't want to be selfish and asking one of my questions first. So, a question here, interesting one. They say, this is refreshing. I hear people argue against individual action and put more emphasis on systems change. But can you get systems change without individual action?
Yeah, I think that's the essential question, because when we reduce people to just individual actions, sort your trash, ride a bicycle, and everything, without the systems change, then you become an alibi for no action. And so it is really about, and the challenge is to see that we are not separate from each other. We are always part of a larger whole. So what I do when I eat a plant-based diet, my family changes as well. My friends change. I ask, you change, you start creating changes in what restaurants offer and things, and you start to see that the individual is part of this larger change, and that but that we cannot ignore that political sphere. So how do I show up? How do I tell a different story? How do I engage politically as well? Because we might say, okay, I can ride a bicycle, but we need the infrastructure. We need the systems to be in place to make that easier. So I think that rather than diminishing people to their, reducing them to just individual actions, we need to start to see people as agents of change.
People can, Karen, obviously, and are hugely politically divided, and they can divide themselves up on those topics, but they can certainly find common change around things, particularly I think around things like nature protection, clean air, and all the rest. I mean, you have for example, in India, communities across religious divides and political lines joining forces to address the Ganges River. I just wonder about the focus and the power of nature itself to drive that kind of change. Carbon reductions, it can all be quite technocratic and difficult for people, also inherently invisible for people to actually tangibly understand. Nature is a different thing, and it can respond in a way that can provide those kind of positive feedback loops.
Yeah, I think it is very, we love nature. I mean, we are nature, so it's very like something that is much more tangible than, like a ton of carbon, for example. But one of the problems is that when we just look at nature as something out there that we enjoy, or recreation, when we look at it for its, like its use values, or that we love it for that, but we don't actually connect who we are with what we do, we can be very split. And Norway is a country where we love nature, and but it doesn't always affect all of the decisions about land use change, about energy production, etc. So I think it's a really important entry point, and that is one of our strategies in the assessment, is to really working on that connection with nature, including shifting cultural narratives, but also through experiential ways. But I think it takes a little bit more of like bringing those values in, to value nature, and to and almost like we haven't really taken nature into our circle of care, and in an ethics of care, and we have a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples and local communities about that.
And I suppose in a rapidly nature depleted world, retaining that connectiveness is going to be an immense challenge. I mean, you speak about this being the decade that matters, but we're facing on the projections an immense reduction in the amount of nature that is around. And so that becomes obviously even more difficult.
Right. And so we need that connection through everything possible, through food, through, like just the small, like we really need to be able to like reimagine nature. And that's where the whole regenerative movement is coming in, to really bring people back to not just sustainability, but regeneration.
We have a question here. Could you elaborate on how to work with and communicate to people who have opposing beliefs on climate change?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think that that actually like curiosity and inquiry goes farther. I have been guilty of like, yeah, of lecturing people about climate change a lot, but it's really to like kind of like ask like, okay, what is it that like what do you think is um yeah, what do you think where does rain come from? How does like starting with all of that, because often like the idea that these molecules are vibrating in the atmosphere and creating heat and everything, like a lot of people have never really thought about that, and many people who are in decision making positions never took ecology or systems thinking or any of this. So I think to work people through that in any way, and ask the questions is really important. because otherwise, people get very fixated and stuck in their own beliefs rather than actually being open to challenging them. So being open-minded, like I've experienced that when I've listened more than spoken, like sitting next to somebody on a train or something like that, it's a lot, it opens space for curiosity and things rather than when I point my finger and tell them that I'm a climate expert and I have studied this and that or whatever.
I mean, it's obvious, is it not, that stories move people more than statistics, that we need emotions over data, but people aren't always comfortable with that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the stories that we can tell too, and we are telling, like, it is the story of climate change is very, I think people were like, oh, it doesn't give a sense of agency. It doesn't, like it's like you must change or else and everything, but like to actually activate that the vision for biodiversity, and which includes then healthy climate, a healthy water, healthy everything, is really important. And so it is, yeah, maybe to tell a different story and to really help people to see that they matter and that what they're doing, because everybody cares about something. And if you could really connect with what people care about deeply, not just for themselves, but for everyone, and sometimes it might just be their children, and the health of all children should be on, like you would extrapolate.
Um, a question here. I've enjoyed your lecture. Thank you. I'm a teacher and I'd love to know how I can translate this for my students. Where do we put our energy? Practically, what should we do?
Oh, that's a great question, because I think well, I have a social initiative called cCHANGE, and I've been doing this with my students a lot, is doing a 30-day challenge with choosing one change and almost getting them to then engage with the practical sphere of, like, okay, if you're going to not use plastic, then you need to find something, a different type of packaging. If you're not going to ride a bicycle, or take a train, you have to do something differently. Logistics and habits come into play. But then also looking in that political sphere, how do your friends respond? How do like how do your family respond when you decide you're not going to eat meat? So looking in the social and cultural norms, but then also the systems, because if we don't have the option to ride a bicycle, if we don't have the option to, when we say get rid of, stop using plastic, but everything is in plastic, we start to see the systemic barriers, we see the systemic challenges, but we also then get to our in the personal sphere of our own assumptions about how other people are and what people are for or against and things. So it really, treating it as an experiment with change is a really good way to engage people with change, and starting to see that when they change, it's through the conversations they have with people that they start to have influences. And it can be very empowering and informative, because you realize that, like, one small change can make a big difference.
Can you talk briefly about your organization, cCHANGE, and what exactly you do?
Yeah, yeah, it was started as a, like, how do we, it's called cCHANGE Transformation and this changing climate. Really, it was back in the early 2010. So we thought we really need to work with society for transformations to sustainability. And so we work with organizations, with schools, with municipalities. We do transformational leadership courses and transformational researchers with impact, and working with, like, energy, like really trying to bring that depth based on the values, based on, basically the three spheres as a framework, to bring it into, what do you care about, what are the results you want to see, and what needs to shift in society, or in cultures or in systems, in order for us to achieve it. So it is like, how do we design strategically for systems change? And so that's really what we're working towards, is systems change, where we put people at the center of it.
And when it comes to changing values, do you see a difference in different age groups? I mean, is it easier, to put it simply, is it easier to get people to shift at an earlier age than an
Yeah.
older age, or older people seeing
Mhm.
that the threat is so immense that they're prepared to insert, to decide that they might have held the wrong value, which
Yeah,
is a
yeah.
hard thing for everyone.
Yeah, I think what we think, Ella, is like we're starting with, like, what people care about, like, so what the values they have, and then they start to see the, like, in terms of integrity and inconsistencies, they realize, like, wait a minute, this is what I really care about, but this is what I'm doing, and they start to, like, to challenge that. And in some of the research I've done with young people, looking at like what motivated them. Equity is often, like fairness is often an entry point for young people to get involved in climate change and say, wait a minute, this is just not right. And so that is those values can be very powerful, because what we care about is what other people care about too, and like in terms of the future. And when we think about the rights of future generations, about other species and things, you start to look at things, and then you start to see that what we're valuing in terms of everyday life and consumption and things isn't aligned with those values that are really enduring.
A question about technology here. Does the threat of technology used for misinformation purposes override the potential technology has to bring people together collectively?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure, like, I'm not the expert on that, but I think that, like in that practical, like people are the ones that like create the technologies, we use them, we abuse them. So it really does, like in that political sphere, how are we going to govern those technologies and decide how to use them? And technology is developing so quickly right now that probably more so than our worldviews and values and things. So how do we organize ourselves in order to use technology for the benefit of people, rather than, and that goes into that disinformation and misinformation, and how do we like stop that? And that goes in, very much like into very practically, like what do we have to do and who do we have to be to really start to question that all the assumptions and what we're reading and everything. And I think again, like like linking the information we're hearing to what we like, where's the alignment with what we care about? We need almost like the sniff test for the information we're reading. And I think that's a skill we all have to develop, because there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there, especially now in terms of climate change.
What do you think is the most urgent policy shift that governments should make right now? I mean, we heard Dr. Emer Cotter earlier mention a national environmental policy in Ireland, a sense of coherence across all policies. But do you have any comments on that? Do you think that would be effective? Are there other policy shifts that government, most effective ones, given the urgency of what we're in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's two things that are in there. We had the Transformative Change Assessment had a sister assessment called the Nexus Assessment, which was looking at biodiversity, climate, water, food, and health, and really showing that you need policies that address all of them, because there will be trade-offs otherwise. So you need that kind of coherence across the different sectors for how to do that. But both their assessment and our assessment also emphasize the importance of like the financial systems. Like right now, we are subsidizing the negative impacts so enormously, and giving very little support for conservation. I think it's about 0.25% of the GDP that is dependent or highly dependent on nature. So our just reforming and revising and stopping some of these subsidies would be an enormous effect on nature, and that includes fossil fuels, that includes land use decisions and things. So policy coherence and transforming our economic and financial systems would be important.
So essentially making it cheaper to be an agent of transformative change.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
once it's cheaper, it'll be easier
Mm-hmm.
And what about a national environmental policy? I mean, this idea of a coherent view, so that when things happen, people don't feel too disheartened. Because I know if you are working locally on something and then you hear a policy announcement by the government or support for different projects that is the antithesis of what that person might be looking towards, it can feel very, very disheartening, and a sense that there's no real connection between the different policies.
Yeah, and I think it also goes for businesses. They need some predictability and certainty, so if they're going to invest in this, and then they know that, oh my gosh, it's going to change every 3-4 years or whatever, that is really important, because it is, we've had this thing where the governments are saying, well, we're waiting for people to want this, and people are saying, well, we're waiting for the government to tell us it's important. So that goes in this, like, how do we like break that divide? And I think a national environmental policy, or like very like consistency and coherence and predictability, would be important. And going back to what the teacher was saying, like that we have to get it really ingrained in us, that what like that our economic system like include nature, include our our climate system in our in the way, everything, governance and economic systems and things, because right now it's always, like the externalities that are ignored.
Can you talk a bit more about language? I mean, you spoke earlier briefly about it, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not obviously just a tool for communication, but it can be a transformative tool in itself. And the kind of words that we use to explain climate change and how it influences how we understand the facts and ideas and
Mm-hmm.
the motivations. So I'm just thinking about things like net zero, carbon neutral. They can be very technical and rather inaccessible, shall we say, whereas clean air for all our kids, we can understand that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there needs to be, or does there need to be, a rather deliberate shift here in the language that we use? Are we stuck on a set of words that really aren't helping in any way when it comes to that change?
Absolutely. And there's been science writers have been writing about this, because like negative emissions, we're seeing that as like, oh, that would be positive, like if we go down in emissions. But many people think negative emissions is bad emissions. So how do we, like, so that language of the jargon that we use in science, and even, like, yeah, that we've made a separation between adaptation and mitigation and things. And most people are just dealing with climate in general. So that precision among the words, I think, is really important, and to start to think about, like, how does this come across in everyday language, as you say, like, what is, like, carbon neutral, what is that, what does it mean, how can we express this in a different way so that we, like, connect with people rather than confuse people. And to me, that is the heart of it. And it is also, going into what you were talking about earlier in terms of the stories that we tell and everything, is that, like, if we make people just into being the problems, then, you will get people putting their heads in the sand and more denial. But if we start to turn people into the solutions, then we start to see that everyone knows a system, whether it's a family system, a football team, a church community, or things like that. They know where the inefficiencies are, where the, like, what needs to change in that system, and it can go on and on. And that's where I think the like, more like looking at the patterns and getting at the underlying causes and creating new patterns or fractals is important.
I'm going to give you two questions in one. Many people are disconnected from the climate and biodiversity crises. How can we encourage people to change behavior and value nature more? Another great lecture, thank you. How to counter resistance to system transformation and those actors wedded to the existing system. So two similar questions there.
Yeah, and it gets into, like, how do we get people to change? And that is then, I think that is a really, like, to get people to engage with climate and biodiversity, we have to, like, it goes into, like, how do we talk about it? How do we get people to start to, like, really be aware of nature and aware of, and I have to say this, like, I didn't take a single, like, science class as an undergraduate, and like I started to learn at, worked at National Geographic, and suddenly realized that there were these rainforests, then I realized I don't even know why it rains. And so I started taking climatology, meteorology, ecology, and all these things, and I think there's a wonder in that, and an amazement, and that, like, to really open up, rather than, and it probably goes into how we teach these things, so, like, that more experiential, it's like, wow, how cool is it, rather than this is what you must learn type of things. And that, like, the experiential, um, I think people have to feel it in their hearts. And that's where, working with art, and a lot of the art I showed is from a Norwegian artist named Tone Bjordam, who, like, really, like, lives in nature, works with nature. And it's a different way of expressing things. And many people will say to me, I didn't understand what you wrote, but the artwork spoke to me. So there's music, there's a whole lot of different ways to get people to really see that, because it's not that, it's more like getting people to remember that they're connected to nature, rather than, like, connect them, because we are connected. And that is the whole idea of entanglement. We don't have to, like, connect with people, we are connected already, but how do we actually, like, really feel that connection, more? And that goes into then, how do, the second question about, like, there are people who have very strong vested interests in the status quo, invested interest in the system, and a lot of power, and we're seeing that play out now. And from that, it's a very small number of people who are actually influencing those systems, and the power of the many is often fragmented very deliberately, so that you don't, like, really to divide social movements across different, things. And what we need then is like the power of the many to come and really like enter into a point of the system, and whether it's through the legal realm, through the cultural narratives realm, there's all different ways of doing it, but it's going to take people to show up, and that is, I think, what we're really seeing now is like that. I kind of imagine like the You Matter movement is to just get everybody to say that, like, okay, this, and we see it happening in the United States now too, that the um, people are just saying like, wait a minute, this is what we care about.
And I suppose people are very motivated by positive stories. They're motivated by what works rather than obviously what fails. Are there any specific success stories, rather, that make you optimistic about climate action in your research that you've come across? Things that have worked?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I feel like that there are, there's a lot of things that are when you look at just like the rate of change of renewable energies, and of course I live in Norway where electric cars are but there's a lot of electric, most cars will be electric in a very short time, but then I also think that, like, well, that's the same paradigm. We actually need to have, like a whole different way of mobility and things. So there's always always find the fault with something. But I think that what excites me is that there's so many things going around, like in communities, in small, or it's like there's so many, like what they call like seeds of the good Anthropocene. Some scientists, there's all these things there, and once we get overcome the barriers and the challenges and create them, then they will actually blossom and bloom. So it is those, exactly those, like the colonial relationships, and there's patterns that have persisted for so many years, that have led to the inequalities, that have led to the power concentrations, that have led to overconsumption and overproduction, and in unequal sharing of technologies, etc. So it's not that it's like rocket science or anything, but it is very much in that political sphere, and it is going to happen through that political sphere, but it's not separate from like what we care about, how we see the world, and how we show up. So
you mentioned Indigenous knowledge. I just wonder what role they can play in climate resilience and transformation, and how do you amplify their stories and their voices in that? Because
yeah.
it is obvious to say we have a lot to learn.
Yeah, exactly. And the IFBES, the biodiversity platform, is very good at including Indigenous and local knowledge, and we have numerous workshops and have them as co-authors, and it is, yeah, you realize that there is just so much knowledge out there already, and it's not just to say that every like there's obviously differences, everything, but there is this wisdom on how to steward the earth, how to have these relationships, and to amplify that is like, when you're going back to like positive news, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People was a very positive change. And the fact that, like, I wrote a textbook on climate and society, transforming the future, and we talk about different discourses on climate change. And it came out in 2019, and we had the biophysical discourse, the critical discourse, the dismissive discourse, and an integrative discourse. And the book was out of date by like 3 years afterwards, because so much had changed. But also we had seen that the ecocentric discourse has really risen rapidly. So we included that as a fifth discourse. And I think that's really promising, that we're starting to see the relationality. We're starting, there's a whole relational turn in the sciences. So when I talk about like quantum social change, it's the same, like that is what many Indigenous people are talking about, is like we are one, we are connected. There is, that nature actually is, part of us, and that is just, I think, like, as more and more people get that, as it comes into our education system, as we use the language that really, like, brings out that entanglement, yeah, things will change too, because we'll think about what we're using and abusing.
A comment here. Thank you for your wonderful presentation, Karen. Conversing with others about climate change can be challenging, especially in today's politically charged environment. As a human geographer, are you aware of a discussion starting point that is more elevated than people agreeing or disagreeing on the science of climate change? Perhaps even not even mentioning the word climate change.
Yeah, I
That's
think that
me
that
adding the
is,
last bit there, by the way.
yeah,
But do you
yeah.
have, a suggested discussion starting point? It doesn't start off with such sort of potential
Yeah,
conflict.
yeah, because there you're right away like getting into defending viewpoints then, and that does, and people then kind of become much more like,
Defensive.
defensive and entrenched in their own viewpoints. And I think then, like I would start with like, yeah, what do you really care about? Like what is so important for you and everything. And when I've again tried, learning about that, I found many people are, they don't care about climate, but they care about like the quality of rivers and like and then like it's to find an entry point that can see like that maybe not every will probably never solve the climate issue as a climate issue. And that's where when we start to think caring for nature, caring for communities, caring for future generations and things, that is essential. But we do need to reduce greenhouse gases. So it's, like at
Indeed.
some point we're going to, and that goes into black carbon, it goes into pollution, it goes into quality of life, etc. And so it's a little bit like doing this, like the gymnastics. But the question is really good, because what is the entry point and how do you connect with people, not just intellectually, but at the heart, so that like, what do you care about? And then getting, and I think again, like the asking people questions more than telling, and that is hard for a professor to say, because like we just like I just tend to like just go into lecture mode about climate change all too easily, rather than to just listen and then hearing that like, oh, people do care about this, and it just comes out in a different way.
And it goes back to another comment here that someone who's doing work on farmers, which this person says are seen as either stewards or spoilers of the land, but we need to speak with and through their shoes if you want to agree policies around addressing climate change, so much as you've said. Another question here. Thanks so much, Karen. Really interesting lecture. Have any metaphors or language stood out to you as particularly useful in explaining the climate crisis, climate action?
Yeah, that's a
Putting you
really
on the
good one
spot there.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was trying to think, because when I teach climate change to undergraduate students, I'm always trying to think, okay, how do I explain this? And I've started to think, because like if you really get down to it, it's like why do greenhouse gases warm the atmosphere? And that is actually a quantum like movement there. It is the vibrations. And so I talk about it as like it's like a rave party. It's like it's a big party in the atmosphere, and we're putting too many people. It's too big a party. But I don't know, like that. I just think that the greenhouse effect maybe doesn't do it so well, and global warming doesn't necessarily do it. So, but many people are feeling it as a crisis right now, and feeling that. But I think if we, yeah, I'm just trying to think how, yeah, like how do we actually get people to really see that, like when we what we're saying is we can transform large scale systems like the climate system, like hydrological systems. Then it's like, wow, we can also transform economic systems. We can transform political systems, because we are the systems, we are the climate, like we are not separate from that. So I would, I think that we need that creativity. And I was part of a book on loan words, because sometimes you don't, like the English language doesn't have the right words, so that like someone put in the word apocalypse. So like it's like a way to think about it is like, oh, how do we actually activate that, the kind of movement that we need for this? And to me, we might need to really find a new way of talking about this, because the current way is certainly polarizing.
Um, while values and language are so important in discourse around environmentalism, how important is public policy as a route to change?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely important, public policy, because that is where the social and cultural norms become actually like part of the system. And you can think in terms of the anti-smoking things. When it becomes a law, then it becomes like predictable, and you change the system. So that really is important. But what we also see is it can go this way or that way. Public policies can change. So it has to be more than superficial policies. It has to actually be entrenched by, like deeply, like with social buy-in, so that people care about that. And I think, for example, that there's more buy-in towards like nature than climate and everything, and more agreement across the political divides about that. So how do we actually link climate and nature? And that is something that is coming back, because it was very much separated in the 90s with the the Rio conference and everything. And now people are starting to see, like, you can't actually look at these as separate. And that, I think, is then going back to how do we have public policies that protect nature and the climate system. And so, whether they're nature-based solutions or whatever, that we start to not think of them as two separate issues in policy.
Indeed, indeed. Excuse me, there is one other question here. Thoughts on intrinsic versus extrinsic values. Sometimes our actions are shaped and influenced by others' expectations of us, or how the economic system influences our behavior. How to achieve more sustainable behavior in an economic system that promotes bigger and more of everything. I think it can feel to a lot of people that we are evidently rapidly going in the wrong direction. But to address that question.
No, it is probably like the biggest challenge, because we are social beings. We are wired to connect with each other and to do what others do. And having a socialized mind is, that is very common, but we can also then start to, challenge that and stand in, what we value, and remind ourselves, okay, I stand for equity. Is purchasing this going to be equitable? I stand for, inclusion or compassion or whatever. Is this a compassionate choice? And starting to recognize where there is the gap between what we care about and what we do is important. So the intrinsic values are, not being overridden by the extrinsic. And then we have to really become like, our sense of agency has to be strengthened. It is much easier to strengthen it in a group when you have others to share. And that's why sharing stories and having like kind of support networks and groups and things like that, to say, like, we're not alone in wanting these types of things for the future. And I think, like really having that the scaffolding of the many to make those changes can be very powerful, because the minute we start to feel like we're alone, we then just go with the old patterns. So we're really are pattern shifters in every way, but we have to have the courage to show up and shift the patterns.
Well, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much. We've got through, I'm delighted, nearly all of the questions that came forward. Thank you so much, Karen, for your insights and for participating this evening. You've left us with an awful lot to think about, for joining us from Oslo, and for being so generous with your time as well in answering the questions.